So what are the things that make you remember? We did annual conference this year in Topeka, Kansas. And even though Nebraska and Kansas have merged into the one Great Plains Conference, it's still a family reunion of sorts when you get together. This Father's Day, I'd like to share a few memories of my dad, who's up there on the screen, who passed away 6 years ago. Because see, my first memories of annual conference were when Dad was the lay delegate for the Albion Methodist Church, and we'd take the camper to Lincoln and camp out while he went to the meeting. I bought my first Bible with money I had earned cleaning out the dairy barn. I bought it at the Cokesbury store that's always at annual conference. That New English Bible was $10. And it's a part of the beginning, I think, of my call to the ministry. One year, the scripture used at the memorial service at conference was this passage from the book of Joshua. Reverend Charlotte Abrams preached a great message about remembering. She told the story of how she and her husband got home one night and found a full glass of water sitting in the middle of the living room floor. So they called their only son, Fred, down from his room, asked him if he knew anything about that glass of water. He was about 13 at the time. He said Aunt Jenny told him to put that glass there. And Charlotte looked at him and said, Aunt Jenny called? He said, oh yeah, Aunt Jenny called and she wants you to call her. So Charlotte called her up, and Aunt Jenny said she told Fred to put that glass out in clear sight in the living room floor just in case Fred forgot to tell Charlotte she had called. The glass of water was a memory device to help Fred in case he forgot. Joshua in the story talks about the same thing, how rocks were to be taken with the nation of Israel to their campsites to help them remember what had happened to them. This is 12 rocks. I'm imagining by the way the story was told, talking about putting rocks on their shoulders, their rocks were a lot bigger. But they were there so that when the children ask, what's the deal with the rocks? They would remember and tell the story of how God had brought them through the River Jordan and stopped the River Jordan from flowing so they could go into the promised land. One year, the Donovan and Rosedale churches took 47 youth and adults to Joplin, Missouri to help with cleanup after the tornadoes. And at the end, we brought back a couple of rocks with us to remind us of that trip, partly because it was such a great trip spiritually, community building wise, but also because Joplin had so many rocks, we figured we were doing them a favor by getting rid of a couple and bringing them back with us. So Mike Hollister filled the back of his pickup with one giant rock for the Donovan Church, and Brad Jones picked up a smaller stone for Rosedale, and they put those stones out in front of the churches, and they are still there today. In case anybody asks when they're coming into the church, what's the deal with the rock? Then they can tell them the story. We went to help with Joplin, Missouri after the tornadoes. It is biblical, like from Joshua, this rock remembering thingy. But there's lots of ways that we remember. Because then there was the golfing thing at annual conference. For several years, there was a clergy golfing tournament the day before the conference, so it was a meeting place for us Karges foursome of pastor golfers, Dad and his 3 sons. My older brother Todd, who's pastor now at Havelock and Lincoln, Todd always hits the ball straight. He may take forever to set up and take 15 practice shots before he hits the ball, but he always hits it straight. My younger brother Casey's pastor at Cortland, Nebraska. He's the guy with the short game. And a lot of times he hits all of us off of the tee. When you're playing best ball, that works. My dad and I were the putters. If everybody else could get the ball onto the green, we could putt it in. Dad had a pretty good short game too. A lot of years at annual conference, there would be 5 of us. The Karges 4 and Jay Vetter, who was pastor here for many years. Dad was at Donovan, Jay was at Grace Church in Hastings, and then Jay was here. They were known for opening up the golf course, meeting the guy with the key at the gate. at sunrise, and they told you more about how many balls they found in the water than about their scores. So, annual conference reminds us of those foursomes and fivesomes. So the year after Dad died, we were there at annual conference, the Karges threesome plus Jay, and I was golfing with my dad's clubs. Because for years, that's what we boys gave Dad on Father's Day. Christmas, birthdays, we gave him golf clubs, we gave him golf accessories. So when he died, since I was the worst golfer of the three boys, I got Dad's clubs. And Dad had this practice of marking his balls, the golf balls, with a big G with a magic marker. So that year I found myself breaking out the magic marker from his bag and putting a big K on all of my golf balls in memory of him. In memory of all those days spent on the golf course looking for Dad's ball and then seeing that big G down in the grass. So this Father's Day, it helps me to remember him because I still got some of those balls. What helps you to remember? What brings it back? See, some memory devices slingshot us back in time, pull the past into the present. I think Holy Communion is kind of like that, bringing God's presence from the past into our present so we participate in who God was and is and change into who God needs us to be. Then as Mom was downsizing and moving to her condo from her house in Lincoln, we discovered several buckets of those old golf balls in Mom and Dad's garage. And I took a bunch of them that he'd already marked with the big G's and put them in a glass vase to be a reminder of him. Kind of like those rocks in Joshua and Joplin. That reminded me of a Journeys article I wrote a while back about my grandma Karges, my dad's mom. I think I've shared it with you guys already. It's called Grandma's Candy Dish. You may remember it. It goes like this. My grandma, Mrs. Jessie Karges, got to be 100 years old before she died in Albion, Nebraska. My first 12 years of existence, we lived in the country. Karges and Sons Dairy was 1 mile west of Albion. During school, when we weren't riding the bus, if we had something after school, or if my folks weren't going to be around when school got out, we got to walk to Grandma's house in town. Now, I know it was only 3 or 4 blocks from the Albion school to Grandma's house, but back then, it was a long way to Grandma's. 2 or 3 turns, some streets with sidewalks, some without. And you only had to go out every way a little to stop by the neighborhood one-room grocery store that took glass pop bottles in exchange for a few cents worth of candy. And if you were lucky, there'd be a few bottles in the grass around the high school parking lot. And when the 11 of us grandkids in school at once in the Albion system, Grandma's yard saw a lot of football games. There was a ping pong table in the basement. She had the only color TV in the family. And there was this magical candy dish that never went empty. A dish that was a green glass bowl with 3 ball claw legs, a matching lid that had a seashell handle on top. It's a miracle it survived all those years of us little dirty hands reaching up over the top of the counter fighting over the candy corn. No matter how many Karges and Beckwith grandkids invaded Grandma's house at a time, everybody always got candy. So if the older kids hogged all those tossed pop bottles, you didn't have to cry about it. You'd get just as much candy as those guys when you got to Grandma's house, and probably wasn't half as old as the candy from the store anyway. Grandma passed away several years ago. My cousins inherited her house. I remember the day my mom called all of us Karges boys to the garage when we were all there at my folks' house in Lincoln, and there were some knickknacks left over from after all the furniture had been divvied up, and we each took a turn choosing what we want. My oldest brother, Todd, got to go first. And for a reason I cannot fathom, he took the framed sketch of our home church done in green yarn, and I couldn't believe it. I reached out, snatched what I wanted as quick as I could before my little brother got any ideas, and I got it. I got the green candy bowl from Grandma's house. See, those first 12 years, my theology was in its infancy. God was like Grandma, always there for you, even when everybody else fell by the wayside. And what symbolized Grandma's never-ending love? What is grace? Grace is like Grandma's candy dish. The greedy, dirty, fighting little hands of the world cannot destroy it, keep it from its purpose, sweetening up sometimes a bitter world. Part of me wants to keep this dish away from my kids so it won't get broken. My belief in God tells me grace, like Grandma's candy corn, is not to be hoarded or kept like a treasure. It's meant to be shared. So Grandma's candy dish sits in my office. Thank you, Grandma. Thanks be to God. So rocks and golf balls and candy dishes help us to remember, not forget the path and the people that got us here. So on this Father's Day, I thought it'd be a good time to share with you what I read at my dad's funeral 6 years ago. Each of us boys were asked to share something. So here we go. I said, in a lot of ways, I'm a totally different person than my dad. On my first Sunday as the pastor at Donovan and Rosedale churches, I made it very clear, I am not my father, who had served those churches for 13 years. Then when I got to preparing to share with you at this funeral, I got to thinking, Dad loved to laugh. He really, really loved to make people laugh. And so do I. He loved a good story. Me too. He used his hands a lot when he preached. That's where I get that from. Music was always a big part of his life, singing and playing. It's the same with me. He loved football, high school football, Husker football. If there was nothing else on, he would watch pro football, same with basketball. That's where I get that from. Once he got something in his head, especially the older he got, he did not budge. So that's where I get that from. And so did you, brothers Todd and Casey. He wrote his sermons at the kitchen table. So do I. He liked to make you laugh and make you cry in the same sermon. Me too. He talked about the price of gasoline and gas mileage in his cars all the time. That's where I get that from. He took off and left the home place and stayed and went to seminary and then came back to Nebraska. Me too. He loved one woman with such depth and ferocity that their whole lives people saw them as a team. Me too. He wore goofy hats in the winter. Me too. I do not preach the same way my dad did. He was out there, no notes. But if you want to continue to hear my dad's voice, his tone, his pace, his preaching, just stop by the Cortland Church, because I've always said you could close your eyes and not tell the difference between my dad and my younger brother Casey when they preach. Dad loved nothing more than to just sit down and have a good chat. He loved good conversation. Me too. He was fiercely loyal to family and friends, and so am I. Dad worked hard at whatever he did. I hope you can say that about all three of his boys. I remember riding in the pickup with Dad when we were little kids, and he would just start singing right there in front of God and everybody. I think he did it just to get us to roll our eyes. That's where I get that from. He loved playing doubles ping pong for hours in the basement with his boys. God, I love that too. He loved golfing with his boys, the Karges foursome. I will always treasure those times. Dad, you're no longer here, but you are not gone because you are so alive in us. And one more thing, my older brother and Todd were talking the other day about Dad as a minister. For him, relationships were the most important thing. So he visited and called and checked up on people in their homes, in the hospital, in old folks' homes. He did confirmation in the summer, 2 solid weeks every day, 8 hours a day, riding around to places in his big conversion van, packed with confirmation kids in the back. Everything he did as a pastor was about relationships with each other, with God. And the words I hear people express to describe him now, over and over again, they say he was kind and gentle, compassionate. And I never got to tell him, as one of the pastors who followed him after his 13 years at Donovan and Rosedale, I need to tell him that there was not a day that went by in my 6 years as their pastor. Somebody didn't say to me, you know, I had your dad for confirmation, or your dad married us, or this thing he said always stuck with me, or your dad really helped me when I was going through a rough spot. So, Dad, even though we pastors now spend a lot of time sitting around talking about how the church is dying, wondering if we're going to make a dent against this darkness of our world, Dad, I want you to know that those kids you had in confirmation, they're still active in church. They're bringing their kids. They want their kids to have what they had growing up. Dad, you had an impact in the souls and faith of so many people, and it is still felt decades later. As a pastor who sat at your old desk for 6 years, on behalf of the church, I just want to say thanks. I only hope I can do the same. And please, God, help me to never forget Dad and all those ancestors who helped bring us into this promised land that we now live in. May we continue to make God's kingdom happen here and now. Amen.